In the previous segment, we talked about two stereotypes, the imperial stereotype and the colonial stereotype. Today, I'm going to talk about two more very important stereotypes, the anti-Semitic stereotype and the other one would be the barbarian stereotype. And after that, what I want to do is to actually apply some of these stereotypes in the context of Ayatollah Khomeini's perception of the world or his worldview and the hostage crisis as it relates to his worldview. So let me begin with the anti-Semitic stereotype. This is a stereotype that is held by people who are seen, or I should say this is a stereotype that is about people who are seen to be culturally very superior to you and are viewed as being infinitely clever. In other words, this is a stereotype you have if you're a core population and you have it toward an overachieving minority. So it's a natural stereotype when you have minorities that are considered achieving above the core. So, for example, in the United States, the Asian Americans have the highest income as a group. So that would be a natural type of a stereotype. Even though the word is anti-Semitic, you will see that I'm using the word, the stereotype as a broader category than merely applying to the Jews. Those holding this stereotype, in other words, those who believe in that, are inclined to see the target as being superior people and who are also capable of orchestrating everything. So, for example, Israelis or the Jews control the American press. That would be part of it. And for me, a good indicator of anti-Semitic stereotype is a belief in pretty elaborate conspiracies. So the anti-Semitic stereotype is often a conspiratorial view of the minority. And the Jews or the Asian Americans, whoever is the overachieving minority, are often not even granted the basic human rights of being stupid and making blunders. And they do, like anyone else. Anyway, the important point to remember about this particular stereotype is that it simply is not to be limited to one particular minority. It is a universal tendency that can be applied to any minority which is highly achieving and who are envied and who are also feared sometimes by majority because of their cleverness. So it is not simply a dislike of their culture. It is a feeling of strong envy and hatred. So in the Middle East, who are these overachieving minorities? The Jews, the Armenians, the Maronites. All of these are in the category of overachieving minorities. Outside of the Middle East, overseas Chinese. Thus, it shouldn't surprise you that in Indonesia, during the Asian currency crisis, circa 1998, late 1990s, people began burning Chinese businesses. And Chinese roughly comprise about 10% of Indonesia's population. Now, this stereotype also has the obverse side. So the obverse side of the anti-Semitic stereotype is what I call the barbarian stereotype. The genesis of this stereotype goes back to the Greeks, who viewed themselves as highly civilized and they regarded the rest of the world as essentially barbarian. So this stereotype is one in which the overachieving minorities view the core majority. So it's the view of the minorities looking at the large swath of the population. And the minority, of course, is the overachieving one. Those who hold this stereotype see themselves, that is the minority who has the barbarian stereotype or believes in the barbarian stereotype, sees itself as culturally superior, but because their numbers are small, they are in a sea of this majority barbarians. And the majority tormentors are such that it scares them in certain moments. So for example, in times of nationalistic movement on the part of the core, oftentimes you will see that the minorities tend to be feeling very much threatened, and their loyalty goes under question. Now, this is the way Israel, for example, saw the Arabs during the crisis period prior to 1967 war. And remember, the 1967 war is a watershed period for me, because after this war, the sense of power on the part of Israel really significantly increased. This is also the way, for example, the core in Greece, which is a much smaller country, views a much larger country, Turkey. The image of terrible Turks really absolutely preoccupies many Greeks. Ancient China, interestingly enough, viewed itself as being tormented by the Mongols and the barbarians. And therefore the point about all of these stereotypes is that they are lethal in their consequences, because they define your view of reality. They shape the way you respond to that reality. And therefore all stereotypes are grossly inaccurate and in some ways pathological. We do need to understand them for the purpose of conflict resolutions. It's very difficult to resolve conflicts, interstate conflicts, or even intrastate conflicts if you don't understand this stereotype and recognize that these stereotypes are often a major obstacle. Now recall I mentioned the 1967 Arab-Israeli War. Since 1967, when Israeli decimated the Arab armies, the Israelis have tended to gravitate toward the very first stereotype I mentioned, and that's the imperial stereotype of the Arabs. The Israelis, after this incredible defeat of the Arabs, see themselves as superior both in terms of capability as well as culture. On the other hand, the Arabs have moved in the direction of anti-Semitic stereotype, which means that these relatively small country, they must be really orchestrating all kinds of conspiracy to get the great powers to always be behind them and be able to support their policy. The point, though, is that if you are to eliminate the conflict, if you are to really address the roots of conflict between Arabs and Israel, between Palestinian and Israel, you need to eliminate these stereotypes as a part of this package of resolving the conflict. Now, I want to go back to kind of an application of what I've been talking about. And this is, I want to go back to the imperial and colonial stereotype and briefly discuss Ayatollah Khomeini's attempt to undermine this twin stereotypes, the twin being imperial and colonial. And it would probably be a defensible case to say that to date, Ayatollah Khomeini has launched the most serious attempt to simultaneously attack the twin imperial and colonial stereotype. So I have to illustrate this proposition that I just mentioned. And the best way I can illustrate this is to do so in the context of the so-called hostage crisis in November of 1979, and to do so by explaining Ayatollah Khomeini's motivations for approving the taking of American diplomats as hostages. But before getting into details of that, the Iran hostage crisis in 1979 in many ways was the most bizarre episode in the annals of diplomatic history. On November 4th of 1979, a relatively large number of Iranian students climbed over the walls of United States Embassy in Tehran, and in short order they managed to get into the compound. There were a large number of them, and they went through the buildings, and the students rounded up several dozens of American diplomats and said that they're going to keep them hostage until the United States returns the deposed Shah of Iran back to Iran to stand trial. Now, as a kind of an event that led to this, the United States admitted the Shah of Iran, who was by then considered a kind of a Flying Dutchman, to come to the United States because he was gravely ill, seeking cancer treatment. So the United States didn't have much of an option other than to allow him to come in, and this is what triggered the hostage crisis. Now, what is important in this context is to remember that all the Iranian officials assured the Americans that the hostages are going to be released within 24 to 48 hours. Well, the time passed and the students refused to negotiate with the government of Iran in order to release the hostages, and instead they went directly to Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the leader of the revolution but as yet had no official role. He was just the charismatic leader of that revolution. Khomeini decided, however, rather than siding with the government that he himself had appointed, he decided instead to side with the students, maintaining that the American diplomats must be kept as hostages. So, from a purely rational perspective, this decision didn't make any sense. If you want to look at it from that angle, it's very hard to rationalize or to make sense of it. Keeping American diplomats, some of which were undoubtedly intelligence officers, was clear violation of accepted diplomatic norms and protocols. Iran was widely condemned by the international community for doing so. And if you no longer, for example, want to have diplomatic relations with a country, then you simply sever your relationship and have their diplomats packing their bags, heading for home, and shut down the embassy. So you can do that. But to keep these emissaries of another country as hostage went against every acceptable norms of modern diplomacy. So most interestingly in this context was that to do so, that is to keep the American hostages, Iran would be paying incalculably exorbitant price for it. First, when Iran refused to release the hostages, the United States cut diplomatic relations and imposed a very, very tough sanctions on Iran. Iran became diplomatically isolated because almost universally that act was condemned. And the United States sanctions proved to be highly effective against Iran because Iran was extremely vulnerable to American sanctions. For example, Iran's armed forces were supplied the most important weapons and the most important the elements of Iran's defense system, including its air force, were all American supplied. And these sophisticated weapons that Shah had acquired prior to the revolution required constant maintenance and spare parts. So without United States spare parts to go to these, to the armies and to the armed forces, to the air force, Iran was very, very likely vulnerable, and it was essentially a sitting duck, unable to defend itself against an aggressor. So it was a big gamble with Iran's national security. And I want to emphasize that because the gamble didn't pay off. The fact was Iran being a sitting duck was not lost on a regional competitor of Iran, Saddam Hussein of Iraq. Lo and behold, 10 months later, when Iran was still holding the American hostages, Saddam decided that this is the right moment for him to strike and invade Iran. Iran was isolated, didn't have spare parts. It was antagonizing much of the West and particularly the United States. So he did invade Iran, and that invasion led to an 8-year war, very much of the old type of World War I, a war in which a lot of casualties was there. And the analogy to World War I was deliberate because, like that war, poison gas was also used by Saddam and to gas Iranian soldiers and the Kurds. So nearly 1 million dead or wounded were the result of that war. And that war was really made possible by Iran becoming so vulnerable for keeping the American hostages. So the point I'm trying to make that this didn't make sense for Iran to do so. And yet we need to explain why Ayatollah Khomeini thought it did make sense. The financial cost to Iran was also tremendous. Iran ended up at the end, when the settlement of the hostages was achieved through an Algiers agreement, Iran ended up paying several billions of cheap loans that had been secured under the Shah of Iran at very low interest rate. By the time Iran was actually paying back those loans, the interest rate in the United States and worldwide had skyrocketed. People were able to earn 18% interest rate in this country by 1980s, early 80s. So Iran ended up paying back the cheap loans as a part of the agreement for the release of the hostages that it had secured, several billions of them, at least 15 to 16 billions of it. And therefore, one could argue the most important beneficiary of the hostage crisis were American banks, who were able to get the cheap money that they had loaned out and be able to now lend it at a much higher interest rate. The point of almost everything that I'm saying is that Ayatollah Khomeini's decision to keep the American hostages came at an incalculable cost to Iran, and yet the Khomeini really thought it was worth doing it. The price was worth it. So the question now is to try to understand why he would reach such a conclusion. Try to understand what was Khomeini's motivation for approving the keeping of the American hostages. And the motivation for doing so, I will argue, is directly linked to Khomeini's worldview, and that worldview is really anchored in kind of a basic dichotomy. So I want to begin with Khomeini's worldview and talk about that. For Khomeini, the world is divided into two main groups. One group is the oppressor groups, and the oppressor group is headed by United States, which he called the Great Satan, and then the Soviet Union. Notice the Soviet Union is part of the oppressor, even though at this time there is the Cold War going on, and by any standard of international relations thought, they would be the main antagonist. That's the main show. But as far as Khomeini was concerned, they're both oppressors. And in order to understand why Khomeini would easily regard Soviet Union as oppressors, because they had close to 70 million Muslims there in the communist nation. So he considered the Soviet Union as a lesser Satan. And of course, all of Western Europe and their legacy of imperialism and colonial subjugation of the Middle East and Africa and parts of Asia, all will fall under this oppressor's world. The other part of the dichotomy is the oppressed world. And for him, the oppressed world includes the third world, the people, nowadays we call it the global south, that includes the Middle East, Asia, Africa, Latin America, all of that area. So that was the essence of the dichotomy that defined Khomeini's worldview. Now, in order to understand how this worldview operates, I want to call your attention, look at the size of the two worlds. The oppressed world is a much larger, reflecting not only a larger population of the world, but for him also the most important part of the world. Whereas the oppressor world is smaller. And the size of these two worlds reflect, as far as Khomeini is concerned, their relative power. All right, the oppressor, according to this worldview of Ayatollah Khomeini, is united when it comes to oppressing the world. Sure, they do compete with each other and they fight among themselves to increase their share of the spoils. But if they are challenged by the oppressed and their hold over them is threatened, they will unite, according to this worldview, to prevent oppressed from liberating themselves and getting rid of the oppressor's dominion. So from that perspective, according to Khomeini's worldview, the oppressors will unite when they are challenged by the oppressed world. The other side of it is that the oppressed are, on the other hand, divided, and their division makes it easy for the oppressors to be able to dominate them. And finally, I mentioned this earlier, the oppressed world is bigger. Should they unite, they will end up to be more powerful. It's their division that cuts into their power. And if they unite, they will be able to defeat the oppressors. And one more thing that I also like to mention in this context is that when you look at this, notice how closely these oppressor perspective relate to the two stereotypes that I mentioned, the imperial stereotype and the colonial stereotype. So the oppressors, according to Khomeini, are suffering from belief in imperial stereotype. In other words, the oppressors look at the world from the perspective of an imperial power. What that means is that they see themselves as far more powerful and culturally clearly superior to those they're oppressing. At the same time, they do see the oppressed as weak, as divided, and culturally clearly inferior to them. So that means the oppressors overestimate their capability. Now let's look at it from the perspective of the colonial stereotype and how this worldview of Khomeini fits into the colonial stereotype. The oppressed see themselves simply as too weak. They accept their inferiority. They look at the technologically advanced oppressor and they said, oh my God, look how backward we are. So in other words, they do accept being inferior relative to the oppressors, and they see the oppressors simply as all-powerful, far more powerful that they could be truly challenged. And therefore, they're unwilling to stand up to the oppressor. So that means, from the colonial perspective, that is those who have the colonial stereotype. And remember, again, colonial stereotype is the way those who are colonized, or in Khomeini's world, those who are oppressed, see their imperial masters. So that means they underestimate, the oppressed consistently underestimate their own capability. Now, the question therefore is that, well, before saying that, let me go back and point out that these two stereotypes are in an important sense obverse of each other. And they're obverse, just like a coin, flipping a coin on both sides. They are reinforcing each other. The oppressors overestimate the power of the oppressors, and the oppressed underestimate its power to stand up to the oppressed. So I may have reversed that, so let me repeat one more time. The oppressors, seeing the weakness displayed by the oppressed, overestimate their capability, and the oppressed consistently underestimate their own power, their own sense of efficacy. So as a result, the two actually work in tandem. They tend to reinforce each other. All right, now the next thing I want to do is to ask you a question, and that is, given this worldview of Ayatollah Khomeini, how the taking of the American hostages can be seen as an attack, as a direct attack on these two imageries, these two stereotypes. How keeping the American hostages tends to erode the salience, the importance of these two stereotypes. So that's the question. Now that we know the two stereotypes, we want to look at a specific act which I described as bizarre in terms of diplomatic history. And yet, given the assumption of Khomeini's worldview, that act made a lot of sense for him. And that's a very important assumption. You don't have to make that assumption. If you don't make that assumption, then it doesn't make sense. Otherwise, it's going to be very, very difficult to make sense out of this. So the proposition that I want to give you is this. Ayatollah Khomeini viewed the taking of the American hostages by the Iranian students as a divinely ordained act. In other words, it was God sent and was a wonderful opportunity for him to be able to attack these two stereotypes, these imageries. The source for my presentation that tries to make the case for this really comes from Iran's foreign minister during the hostage crisis, Mr. Sadegh Qutbzadeh. He was a very smart and very adventurous man, and so adventurous that at the end he is implicated in a plot trying to kill Ayatollah Khomeini, and he gets executed. But he really understood his worldview, and that worldview was conveyed to my mentor, who then explained it to me. So the question is, relating this worldview to the act of hostage taking. So how so? And therefore, I want to address that. By taking the American hostages, Iran and these students would show the world that Iran can stand up to the most powerful oppressor nation in the world, the United States, and the United States will be unable to do anything about it. Notice, inability of the United States to free the hostages would serve notice to the world, as far as Khomeini was concerned, that America is not as powerful as you thought it was. So what he would be doing is, hopefully, by demonstrating what I just said, to show you how the two stereotypes are going to get eroded. By keeping the American hostages, Khomeini would be showing an abject lesson, or will be giving an abject lesson to the United States that the era of their domination is over. And therefore, here is a concrete example that we are holding your people as hostage. there is nothing you can do about it. It would have to be a humiliating experience for the United States. So as far as Khomeini was concerned, you would teach the oppressor, and in this particular case, the United States, a lesson that the era of your domination is over. But then the act also teaches the oppressed that they are now able to stand up and defeat their tormentors. In other words, then, by keeping the American hostages, Khomeini was trying to teach the United States that the Iranian Revolution has brought an end to their domination of Iran and the region. At the same time, it would demonstrate to all those who are oppressed, including Africa, that and the global South, that it is possible to stand up and face the oppressor, and to prove that there's not much the oppressor can do. Because after all, it was important to us to make sure that the hostages remain alive. So in other words, his aim was to humiliate the United States, to rub its nose and on the ground, and by keeping the hostages, he keep on a daily basis saying, don't worry about the United States. To quote his word, there is not a damn thing the United States can do about it. Relax. At the same time, though, the oppressed people of the world, when they see the humiliation of the United States, their sense of efficacy would go up, and now they too would be willing to challenge the oppressors. So the whole point of taking these hostages, in essence, was this frontal attack on the prevailing imageries of the twin imperial and colonial stereotype. So Ayatollah Khomeini was consciously trying to let the people know that this is a different time, that the Iranian Revolution marks the beginning of an end of imperial domination or neo-imperial domination. That they are not, that is, the oppressor are not as strong as we have thought them to be, and to show the people of the Middle East and the Third World, the Global South, that they are not as weak as they had assumed to be. So his was an attack on these twin stereotype of imperial and colonial. And I think when you come to think about it, I cannot think of too many leaders who have really come up with a strategy of dealing with that. Now, I must say, I'm not at all implying this was a conscious planning on his part. For him, it was purely intuitive. If you ask Ayatollah Khomeini, explain to me what is imperial stereotype, what is colonial stereotype, he would not be able to do that probably. He would do it in terms that I just explained to him: oppressed, oppressed, oppressor world. But you see, oppressed and oppressor world have their analog in imperial and colonial stereotype. So hopefully this would make sense of that bizarre episode, which otherwise was horrible for Iran. Iran ended up paying through the nose for it.